the former vice president under the George W. Bush administration, Richard Bruce Cheney, also known as Dick Cheney, has died today. And I've covered the deaths of former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of State Colin Powell. And as Bush's inner circle continues to decay and die off, leaving the devil himself to remain living. Easily the most powerful vice president in my lifetime, probably the most powerful vice president in administrative history, has been bereft, especially in his latter years, with major conspiracy and a lot of illegality and immorality. And I'm just going to keep it recent. After the 9/11 attacks, Cheney was actually instrumental in providing a justification for a renewed war with Iraq, with the initial Iraq war in 1990 being a little bit of a failure regarding that Hussein had lived. Cheney himself had shaped Bush's approach to the war on terror, making numerous public statements alleging that Iraq had, weapons of mass destruction. He actually went on Meet the Press and stated, this is right after the 9/11 attacks, and stated that the State Department and the intelligence services, namely the CIA and the NSA, had to go to the dark side to defeat the threats to our national security. Even after the FBI saw that there was no link between Al-Qaeda and the 9/11 attacks with Iraq, Cheney still continued to allege links between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, even though Bush received a classified presidential daily brief on September 21st, 10 days after the 9/11 attacks, indicating that the U.S. intelligence community had no evidence linking Saddam Hussein to the September 11 attacks. They had to make an office inside the White House called the Office of Special Plans, which was headed by the Undersecretary of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz, and Douglas Feith. These are dual loyalties to the United States and Israel. Israel was trying to push for this conflict. In fact, the former prime minister at the time, he wasn't the prime minister at the time, Benjamin Netanyahu, went before the Senate Select Committee, and I think it was the House Oversight Committee or the Senate Select Committee, and basically told them that Iraq was procuring a chemical biological weapon in hopes of trying to obtain a nuclear bomb, and considered them to be a direct threat to the West, and the United States needed to attack it. I remember even in, what was it, 2014, 2015, Cheney, even after all the evidence was out that Al-Qaeda had no relations with Saddam Hussein, that the Iraq was facilitated on evidence based from torture from an individual named Beeman Sheikh al-Libi. Even back then, he continued to mislead the public, stating that Saddam Hussein had a 10-year relation with Al-Qaeda. There was no evidence to suggest this. And following the invasion of Iraq in 2003, it was Cheney who remained, the leading cheerleader for the war, stating it would turn out to be an enormous success story when it's all said and done. He actually went to Iraq numerous times. And there were a number of people that criticized his views on Iraq. But he actually called them opportunists. Meanwhile, Cheney was the alleged CEO of Halliburton, although that comes into some dispute, but he was a major shareholder with the company, and they had won billions of dollars in the contract during the war. So I would say he was an opportunist. His adversary was Senator Kerry, who once went on the air, I think it was in Fox News, and stated that it was hard to name a government official who was like less credible than Dick Cheney. He said that when Bush won the second term. Um, when he went against John Kerry, Cheney stated that he was in favor of gay marriages because personally he felt that each individual should decide whether to permit it or not, even though that a number of Bush officials who were evangelical Christians were opposing of this. But Cheney was so powerful that it didn't matter what anyone else thought. You know, there was that running joke in Washington that if Cheney died, Bush would become president. That's how powerful Cheney was. And, you know, Cheney in the early morning, in that later hours, in the afternoon hours of 9/11, Cheney was in the Presidential Emergency Operations Command Center, which is the PIOC, right? And he was there all throughout the day. He was in charge of the PIOC on September 11th because Bush wasn't there. Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld was out of the Pentagon when the Pentagon was being hit. And so Cheney was in command of the military at that point. Now, he's not in the military chain of command. But after, you know, when the days after 9/11 happened, Cheney, who was a big skeptic of the CIA, he was insistent on reviewing the data himself due to the fact that there was no proper analysis of intelligence given to the president at the time. He didn't trust Tenet. Bush trusted Tenet because that's who Tenet trusted. He didn't trust Cheney either. Now, with the exception of Richard Clarke, which is the counterterrorism, you know, who is the terrorism czar under Clinton and Bush, it was the CIA's counterterrorism center and the FBI. Along with the Bush administration, that had no insight into bin Laden or Al Qaeda. Why? Because the Bush administration didn't think it was important. And Cheney was whispering in Bush's ear all throughout the early tenure of 2000 that the threats were China and North Korea. Cheney was from the Cold War era. Don't forget that during the 1980s, Cheney was participating, along with Richard Clarke, by the way. He secretly participated in a very top secret program, which simulated a doomsday scenario where it was to ensure the continuity of government in a nuclear fallout with the Soviet Union. What was happening in the days after 9/11? A continuity of government situation. That operation, by the way, was a challenge, was to ensure civil order and control over the military in the event when, say, most of the the executive branch is decimated. Right. The executive branch. That's why Cheney was so calm during 9/11. Because he went through a number of these operations where he had to sit and live in a bunker for days. Now, it's the aftermath. The action is in the reaction, right? Cheney saw fit to add some of the best lawyers in the country, people like David Addington, his personal lawyer, John Yoo, Alberto Gonzalez, who would work in secret at the White House while the Department of Justice came up with legal ramifications for a vast expansion of government power in the waging of the war on terror. Every war makes the White House and the Department of Defense more powerful. And what did these lawyers do? Well, they created some of the worst legislation in history illegally. These lawyers the ones I named, drafted legislature in which enemy combatants would not be protected under the Geneva Convention and where torture can be legal to an extent and where the president can suspend the writ of habeas corpus, which guarantees a person the right to challenge his imprisonment in front of an independent authority. Now, back then, Arthur Schlesinger was basically known for being a historian and the son of Arthur Schlesinger Sr., who is actually one of the more profound American historians ever in this country. He was asked once what he thought of Bush's policy on torture in 2000 was. 2001. And Schlesinger said, quote, "No position taken has done more damage to the American reputation in the world ever," end quote. And guess who was behind that decision? Cheney was. Hey, even worse, fuck this, right? On the evening, now, not many people know this. On the evening of September 11th, a series of cables was shown to the CIA director, George Tenet, along with his chief of staff, John Mosman. And they found that the CIA was closely monitoring two men, Khalid al-Badr and Wahab Hazmi, which was unknown to the FBI and the State Department, all the way starting in January 2000, when they reported that they lost track of both men to the State Department and the principals' meetings, all the way to Malaysia. The next day, Tenet would lie to the National Commission. Later on, not the next day, but later on, Tenet lies and stating that the joint lied not just to the commission, but to the joint inquiry. And I think I'm the only person ever to point out these counts of perjury, where he claimed the CIA had warned the White House about bin Laden in August of 2001. That wasn't the case. So Cheney had a number of dealings with a lot of different companies, Halliburton being one. He was also part of the American Enterprise Institute. He was a prominent member of the National Emergency Policy Developmental Group, known as the Energy Task Force. And there was a lot of scandals with him. If you remember back in like the early 2000s, it was the Washington Post that reported that Cheney's office was central to the investigation of Valerie Plame, the CIA's leak scandal. Cheney. His former chief of staff, Louis Libby, was one of the figures under investigation. It was Libby who resigned his position as Cheney's chief of staff and assistant on national security affairs after he was indicted. But he was getting orders from Cheney. And if you don't know about the scandal involving Valerie Plame, she was an American writer, a spy for the Central Intelligence Agency, and was subject to what was called the Plame affair, which was a CIA leak scandal in which Plame's identity as a CIA case officer was leaked and published by the Washington Post. Cheney was behind that, but Libby took the fall. What a piece of shit this guy is. And also, let's not forget that Cheney actively promoted the expansion of powers of the presidency, saying that the Bush administration challenges to the laws which Congress passed after like Vietnam and Watergate to contain and oversee the executive branch. This guy has been behind. It's ridiculous what this guy was behind. his influence on decisions pertaining to detention and suspected terrorists, and the legal limits that apply to their questioning under torture, which was renamed by the White House counsel under his authority to enhance interrogation techniques. I interviewed Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who served as Colin Powell's chief of staff when he was the Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman. Cheney stated in an interview that it was Cheney and Rumsfeld who established, an alternative program to interrogate detainees, separate of the CIA. A lot of people don't know this because he still distrusted the CIA, Cheney. And by the way, just to add to, these were no friends to Israel either. Yes, they'll deal with Israel on a playing field, but never go above and beyond for them. The Bush dynasty was very distrustful of Israel, and so was Cheney, by extension. This is the reason why he was so distrustful of the CIA. So yes, they'll deal with Israeli intelligence to an extent, but never fully trusted the government. Never trusted Ehud Barak. Never trusted Netanyahu. Never trusted Ariel Sharon. They didn't. They really didn't. And, Cheney, I mean, here's a guy that basically deserves to be under the Hague. And to make matters worse, Cheney, along with the Department of Defense, authorized the use of known illegal practices to coincide with the CIA's SEER program, which basically is the SEER program, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. Survival, resistance, evasion. That's what SEER is. And this was used to derive information from detainees like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Ramzi bin al-Shib, Mustafa al-Hassawi, Amr al-Baluchi, and Tawfiq bin Attash, also known as Claude. The 5 men charged for 9/11 attacks. 2 now can't be tried because of the torture that they experienced. Now, it's just a matter of time before the other 3 and their lawyers basically either make a deal with the State Department or to have the judge, basically the Guantanamo judge, I think McNeil is there, but he might be replaced soon, to basically state that these people are not mentally fit. And that's why they can't be charged for 9/11 attacks, because everything they said was under duress. Not to mention the Iraq War. I mean, fuck's sake, this guy with the torture program in Iraq War, the rewritten programs under the Geneva Convention for detainees, foreign detainees, still holds true today. And this guy was behind not just the Gulf, the Iraq War in 2003, but the Iraq War in 1990. This guy was the epitome of evil. On the evening of September 12th, the day after 9/11, the first and only foreign flight to enter U.S. airspace, after which the national shutdown, was a private jet carrying and a lot of people don't know this too. I wrote about this in an article, that there was a private jet carrying a number of British intelligence officials, which included Sir Richard Dearlove, who was the chief of MI6 at the time. The other one was David Manning, the foreign policy advisor, because the British were actually really concerned about how the United States would react toward Al Qaeda, because the rumor, which reached across the pond, was that Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, Feith, Richard Pearl, and the rest of those sicko neocons of the um, Office of Special Plans, as well as the Project for New American Century. Remember that? And fucking Richard Kagan and those sickos, Bill Kristol, because they were going to invade Iraq. And by extension, that means the Britons are going to be behind because they're a major player in the coalition partners of the United States. So the British went there nervous about how the United States would react toward Al Qaeda. And at that time, Tenet still didn't, find any information about Al Qaeda in Iraq. But like I said, many of the dual citizens of Israel neocons were whispering in Bush's ear. The very next day, Bush convened the National Security Council in the Situation Room, where they met with George Tenet and the head of the Counterterrorism Center, Cofer Black, briefing them about finally getting behind the Northern Alliance with a CIA paramilitary team and the CIA Special Forces, which is the Special Activities Division, along with the U.S. Army's Special Forces. This actually was so similarly proposed in the summer of 2001, but nobody wanted to basically get behind it. Now the CIA wanted to be pulled behind because 9/11 happened. But it wasn't that. It was during the end of the briefing. Cofer Black turns to Bush and Cheney, and he says, "You give us this mission, we can get them, and we'll have the flies walking on their eyeballs." Well, Bush was persuaded. Cheney was not, because Cheney didn't give a shit about Afghanistan, while everyone over there was. Cheney knew what Pearl knew, what Wolfowitz knew, what Feith knew, was that the real threat is Iraq. Why? Because that's who the Gulf wanted out. That's who Israel wanted out. That's who Turkey wanted out. It wasn't Afghanistan. It was Iraq. Afghanistan was Bush, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, and the CIA. Remember what I said? Cheney didn't like the CIA. Didn't care for them. So Cheney, along with his lawyers, drafted another proposal that would give the Bush White House unchecked authority to do virtually fucking anything. And it was, once again, Alberto Gonzales, who's the lead counsel at the White House, demanded that Congress expand Bush's authority even further than what I talked about before. Cheney pushed for this. Cheney was the one who told Bush that we are to wage war against suspected terrorists, not terrorists, suspected terrorists, and that it would be up to the president, not the Department of Justice, to determine who's a terrorist. By the way, that still holds true today, because Congress approved on the compromise unanimously. This actually gave the president of the United States the authority to treat any war on terror as an armed conflict with very few boundaries. Bush and any other president in history could use all necessary and appropriate force to wage war against any nation harboring terrorists, whether they were persons, organizations, determined by Bush to be terrorists. On September 14th, just 3 days later, the Senate votes unanimously 420 votes to 1 on the unlimited war powers for the president. Cheney was behind it. Also, another proposition by Cheney was that the government could also shoot down civilian airliners that were hijacked by terrorists and set up military operations inside American cities. The two men that were involved with this were John Yoo, who I mentioned before, and Deputy Chief of the Justice Department, Timothy Flanagan, who was acting as a lawyer for the White House Counsel Office. Oh, it just so happened that both men were part of the Federalist Society, which is a group of conservative lawyers who want to reestablish the original interpretation of the Constitution. These motherfuckers. Cheney's own lawyer, David Addington, actually wanted to authorize the fight against terrorism, against a criminal justice matter, to being a full-fledged military war, not even against, not involving the FBI, not involving the, let's say, the NSA, the Office of National Intelligence, and all this, right? No, use the military. Because Rumsfeld was really salivating at the aspect of that because he's Secretary of Defense. Which actually, because of this idea brought forth by Addington, Cheney's personal lawyer, this would allow for, say, the CIA and the Pentagon to capture or kill suspected terrorists as swiftly as possible without any latitude. Cheney made it clear that he wanted to be aggressive on the law, and he didn't care how many boundaries he had to break. So what happened? John Yoo actually proposed that there should be no limit for the President of the United States regarding timing or place in the war on terror. And by the way, the war on terror is forever. There is no end date. So in the month after, and this is really big, what I'm about to tell you, I think it was in October, I can't tell you when, I don't know the date, but Cheney called for a meeting with the members of the House and Senate Intelligence Oversight Committee. Closed door. And he outlined a closely guarded plan from Bush, which was, and this is really fucking unbelievable, to have a terrorist surveillance program which would allow for the National Security Agency, the NSA, to intercept phone calls and other communications, including emails, domestic and abroad, meaning emails coming from the United States to abroad or from abroad to the United States, and intercept these emails without a warrant. And this was a big issue because the White House counsel and even lawyers from the NSA had to argue about how the hell are we going to bypass laws regarding the privacy of citizens' data, right? Well, that didn't stop Cheney. In fact, it was Cheney and Bush that the national security, I'm sorry, Andrew Card, who would engage with the NSA director, Michael Hayden, another fucking evil devil, about the need for the NSA to collect as much data as possible without the use of walls, without the use of rules, law. And he was given a green light. And what happens after that? Well, members of the Project for the New American Century I talked about, PNAC, they published a letter addressed to Bush, insisting that the war on terrorism include one of its objectives, which was the removal of Hussein. That was a major proposal in the original Project for the New American Century under Robert Kagan and William Crystal. Signing it off on it was the neocons themselves under the Bush administration, because remember, PNAC was created under the Clinton administration, and they tried to push him for the war on terror on Iraq, and he refused. Remember, there was a scandal. But this proposal was even worse because PNAC went a little bit further and even stated in the letter, quote, even if evidence does not link Iraq directly to the attacks, failure to undertake such an effort will constitute an early and perhaps decisive surrender in the war on individual terrorism, end quote. And to go a little bit further, and I'm sure Israel was behind this, because PNAC also said the United States should demand that Iran and Syria cease all support for Hezbollah. And if they didn't, the United States would retaliate against those two countries as well. Oh, let me see. What happened to Syria after the Bush administration? During Obama, which was an extension of Bush's policies for all you progressives out there. And what happened under the first Trump administration. We went to war. Well, not directly, but we used the CIA to conduct an operation called Timber Sycamore, which was to fund and train and give military armaments to the Saudis, which was actually green light approved by Turkey and Israel to force the expulsion of Bashar al-Assad. And I remember during that time, because I saw during Twitter when I, used to go on Twitter, I didn't have an account then, but I used to see military soldiers putting up, signs. I didn't sign up to fight alongside Al Qaeda. So this is what Cheney leaves behind: 1.5 million deaths in Iraq, countless thousands in Afghanistan. The policies that transferred over to the Obama administration, which was the destruction of Syria and Libya, the torture program under the CIA's own architects, Dr. Bruce Jessen and James Mitchell, which tortured all of the individuals that were charged for 9/11 attacks, which basically we cannot use because they were under duress. Cheney knew this, Rumsfeld knew this, CIA knew this, but they did it anyway. The many hundreds of people that were detained without warrant, without any charges, and that were found to be innocent, all these Muslims that were in Guantanamo, was over 800 of them. The repeated warnings of an attack upcoming by Al Qaeda in the summer of 2001, ignored by Cheney, sometimes deliberately. How many fucking lives were disrupted, that were destroyed by this guy? I'm sure his family loved him. I'm sure he loved his wife, Lynn, his children. I'm sure that was genuine. But outside of that, I'm talking about outside of that, he's as evil as the day is long, and will go down for me as a top 3 most reprehensible people I've ever experienced. The man is responsible for millions and millions of people who were forcibly displaced in the Middle East through these disastrous wars that he got us involved in. One illegal war, highly illegal, Iraq, 2003. The policies he left behind, which basically reshaped the neoconservative movement into something even far more radical, which later fundamentally changed to something more grotesque. And to show you that what I said is true, and I'll never forget this, Dick Cheney, when he saw that Trump was running for a second term, backed the least liked, the least respected vice president in history, the most progressive or most militant liberal, right? Nothing classic liberalism, nothing, classic conservative liberalism doesn't exist. What exists is this grotesque features that identify as left and right. But what they are is basically one gigantic cancer cell that broke off in 2 areas, but they're active in accordance. I don't say what they do is left and right. I don't think those policies exist anymore. But Cheney backed Kamala Harris because he saw what was coming. And what was coming was that a bunch of religious fucking fanatics, like a bunch of Kahanists in Israel, like Ben Gvir, Smotrich, and Yosef Struk, and all those sickos, well, that's what's behind Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not part of that. He's being used. What's behind Trump is the American Enterprise Institute, the Birch Society, the Heritage Foundation, all these major televangelists like Joel Osteen, John Hagee, okay? The people that want total unequivocal servitude to not just Israel, but also to an unceasing war in the Middle East. Well, that created a subsection of anti-Jews, anti-Semites across the board, hate Israel, hate Jews, but hide behind the anti-Zionist effect. But this is what Cheney created. He helped to create this with his disastrous policies that were created back in the mid 90s. And during his tenure as vice president, those policies took shape and took form like a living organism, and it became a monstrosity to what we see today. A monstrosity that has an enemy within its own existence. Cheney helped to create this. And this is the reason why I find him to be just one of the most deplorable individuals on planet Earth, because he harmed and destroyed so many lives, so many fucking lives. And it's a matter of forgiveness, right? I'm not going to end this video by stating that, I'm glad he's dead. I'm going to end it in a way like with Rumsfeld and Powell, the same way. Cheney doesn't deserve your scorn. He deserves far worse. He deserves your silence.